There's this moment in history, June 23rd, 1757, that doesn't sound all that dramatic when you first hear it. Just another battle, another name, another date. But that day, it changed everything. You had Siraj-ud-Dowlah, the Nawab of Bengal, standing with nearly 50,000 soldiers, and across from him, just 3,000 British troops under a man named Robert Clive. Now, if you're doing the math, that should have been a one-sided fight. No way the British should have won that. But they didn't win because they were stronger. They won because they had already played their cards before the battle even started. Siraj's own general, Mir Jafar, had cut a secret deal. He promised not to fight. So while the Nawab expected loyalty, what he got was silence. And just like that, Clive didn't conquer a city. He cracked open the gates of an empire. Fast forward just 8 years, and the British East India Company, which, remember, was still technically a trading company, now had the right to collect taxes in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. These weren't just any territories. They were some of the wealthiest, most productive regions in all of South Asia. Now imagine being a farmer in Bengal around that time. Let's say your harvest failed. Maybe the rains didn't come, or maybe they came too hard. Either way, your granary's nearly empty and your kids are hungry. But the British tax officer doesn't want your story. He wants your money. And if you don't have coins, they'll take whatever you do have. Your oxen, your tools, even your land. And that's not just survival at risk. That's your future being repossessed. What's worse is that none of that wealth stayed in your village. It wasn't building wells or roads or schools nearby. It was being packed up and shipped out, sent across oceans to fund cities you'd never see and wars you didn't start. And if you think the British just wanted taxes, you're missing half the picture. They didn't just take from India, they undermined it. Take Indian textiles. We were global legends. Muslin from Dhaka was so light, so fine, it was called woven air. European aristocrats wore it like a badge of luxury. But when British factories started mass-producing cheaper cloth back home, they realized something dangerous. Indian fabric wasn't just beautiful, it was better. So instead of competing, they banned Indian cotton in Britain entirely. Then they flipped the script, flooding Indian markets with their factory-made goods. And just like that, our weavers, artisans who had passed down skills for generations, were out of work. They didn't lose their jobs because they made bad products. They lost them because they made products too good to compete with. By the time it was over, cities like Murshidabad, once buzzing with life, looked like they'd been paused mid-breath. One British officer even said Bengal resembled a graveyard of weavers. He wasn't exaggerating, and this wasn't a one-off chapter in a dusty history book. This was a 200-year drain. According to economist Utsa Patnaik, from the late 1700s to the early 20th century, the British extracted nearly $45 trillion from India. That's not a typo. 45 trillion in today's value. We were just colonized. We were leveraged, taxed, stripped, and repackaged into someone else's industrial revolution. And then, in 1947, India became free. The British left. The flag rose. And a nation that had once fueled empires finally stepped out to chart its own course. But behind the cheers and fireworks was a different kind of silence. One filled with exhaustion, with grief, with uncertainty. India's industries were gone. Its institutions were only just beginning to form. And the treasury? It held barely enough to function. Yes, the country had earned its independence, but economically, it had been emptied long before that final handshake. In the years that followed independence, India faced a monumental question. Not just how to govern itself, but how to rebuild what had been stripped away. Jawaharlal Nehru, the country's first prime minister, believed that freedom meant little without self-reliance. He wasn't chasing quick wins. He was trying to reimagine what progress could mean for a nation that had been drained of wealth and dignity for over 2 centuries. He looked toward the idea of a planned economy, a model where the government wouldn't just regulate industry, it would create it. So India launched its first 5-year plan in 1951. A massive effort to stabilize agriculture, increase food production, and make sure the next famine would never come. And it worked, to a point. Food output increased. Hunger eased. But Nehru understood that feeding people wasn't enough. If the country wanted to stand on its own, it needed more than grain. It needed steel, energy, machines, and time. By the second 5-year plan, the focus had shifted. India was building from the ground up, literally. Steel plants were set up in Bhilai, Rourkela, Durgapur. Hydroelectric dams stretched across rivers like monuments to ambition. The government owned everything. Banks, oil companies, telecom, even airlines. It was a bold attempt to shape an industrial nation out of what was still, for the most part, a rural economy. But with that control came complexity. India was trying to do something nearly impossible. Catch up with 100 years of industrial development in just a few decades, and do it with limited capital, fractured infrastructure, and rising expectations. And slowly, the cracks began to show. Between 1962 and 1966, India hit a wall, one crisis after another. First came war with China, a military defeat that not only exposed vulnerabilities on the border, but forced the country to rapidly increase defense spending. Then, in 1965, came another war, this time with Pakistan. By 1966, a severe drought paralyzed food production. The Green Revolution hadn't arrived yet. Farms failed. People lined up for rationed grain. To feed its people, India had to import wheat from the United States under something called the PL 480 agreement. And for a time, it worked. Until politics got in the way. When India spoke out against the United States' involvement in the Vietnam War, the diplomatic fallout was immediate. President Lyndon Johnson responded by tightening food shipments, making them conditional, monthly, uncertain. India was stuck, hungry, politically cornered, economically fragile. So in 1966, the government made a difficult choice: devalue the rupee, a 36.5% drop in the currency's value, done in hopes of making exports more competitive and earning the dollars needed to buy essentials. But the gamble didn't pay off. Exports didn't rise fast enough. Imports became more expensive. Prices went up. And for many families, the pain became personal, not theoretical. In 1969, Prime Minister Indira Gandhi made a bold and controversial move. She nationalized 14 major banks. The idea was to redirect credit toward farmers, small businesses, and rural development, people and regions that had long been overlooked by private lenders. It gave the state more power. It also concentrated responsibility. By this point, India had become a country where the government didn't just write the rules. It played every position on the field. But with central planning came bureaucracy. And with bureaucracy came stagnation. By the 1970s, something called the License Raj had taken full form. To open a factory, change a product, or import raw materials, you needed permission, and not just one. Dozens. The system was meant to protect the economy from monopolies and foreign control. But in practice, it discouraged innovation and punished speed. If you had connections, You could navigate it. If you didn't, you waited. Or worse, you gave up. It was a system where ideas died on desks and paperwork took the place of possibility. Then, in 1975, India declared a national emergency. Civil liberties were suspended. The press was muzzled. Political opponents were jailed. And while the emergency is often remembered for its political darkness, something else was happening in the background. The global economy was shifting. Oil prices spiked dramatically, first in 1973 and again in 1979. India, a major importer, was hit hard. Inflation soared. Growth stalled. Unemployment rose. It became clear that the model India had built, heavy on government control, light on flexibility, was starting to run out of steam. When Rajiv Gandhi became prime minister in 1984, after the tragic assassination of his mother, he brought with him the energy of a new generation. He wasn't shaped by colonial memory in the same way. He was shaped by technology, aviation, and the idea that India could modernize through connectivity and information. Under his watch, early steps were taken to promote computers, telecom, and digital literacy. But it wasn't enough, not fast enough, not wide enough. Because behind the scenes, the economy was still struggling, borrowing heavily, spending more than it earned, and slowly heading toward a point of no return. By the late 1980s, India's economy was running on fumes. Public spending kept growing, but revenues weren't keeping up. Foreign debt had ballooned to over $70 billion, and more than a quarter of India's export earnings were being used just to pay the interest on that debt, not even the debt itself. At a household level, it was like using one credit card to pay off another, while interest quietly ate everything. The country's fiscal deficit had reached 8.4% of GDP. Inflation was rising. Investment was falling. And confidence, that was gone. What made it worse was that the warning signs weren't just academic. They were lived. People could feel it. Then came the Gulf War. In August 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Oil prices soared. India, heavily dependent on imported oil, saw its import bills spike almost overnight. At the same time, over 3 million Indian workers across the Gulf were suddenly out of work, many of them sending money home to families who relied on every rupee. Those remittances dropped. The oil bill doubled. And suddenly, a crisis that had been creeping for years was now sprinting toward collapse. By mid-1991, India had only enough foreign exchange reserves left to cover 2 weeks of imports. Just 14 days. That's how close the economy came to total failure. To prevent a default, India did something it had never done before. It secretly flew 67 tons of gold, actual physical gold, to the Bank of England and the Union Bank of Switzerland to use as collateral for a loan. Think about that for a moment. A nation once known as the Golden Bird was now pawning its last reserves just to buy time. It was, in many ways, the lowest point in India's post-independence economic history, but also the beginning of something new. On July 24, 1991, India's new finance minister, a quiet economist named Dr. Manmohan Singh, stood before Parliament and opened his budget speech with a line that still echoes today. No power on earth can stop an idea whose time has come. He wasn't just presenting a budget, he was presenting a reset. In one sweeping move, India began to dismantle decades of state control. Licenses were scrapped, import duties were slashed, foreign companies were invited in. The rupee was devalued, and Indian entrepreneurs, for the first time in a generation, were told, "Go build." And India did build. Companies like Infosys, Wipro, and TCS stepped into the global spotlight. They didn't need heavy machinery. They needed minds. And India had millions of them. Software exports began to rise. Cities like Bangalore and Hyderabad transformed into tech corridors. The middle class began to grow. And for the first time in decades, people started imagining a future beyond ration cards and waiting lists. India wasn't just recovering, it was repositioning. The early 2000s brought speed. Mobile phones moved from luxury to necessity. Shopping malls sprang up in every metro. Call centers connected Indian voices with global customers. GDP growth hit 8%. Stock markets boomed. Credit cards arrived. So did car loans and dreams of international vacations. The phrase India shining was more than a slogan. It was a sentiment, especially in the cities. But there was something quietly missing, something underneath the shine. While urban India moved forward, rural India was still waiting for the basics. Electricity, healthcare, even reliable school teachers. Agriculture, which still employed a majority of India's population, hadn't kept pace, and as costs rose but returns didn't, despair quietly crept in. Between 1995 and 2015, over 300,000 Indian farmers died by suicide. Most of their names never made headlines, but their stories told the truth, that GDP doesn't always measure pain. At the same time, a new class of billionaires emerged, powerful, global, and deeply connected. Some built their empires through innovation, others through influence, many through both. And slowly, a different kind of divide began to take shape, not just rich and poor, but seen and unseen, connected and disconnected, prospering and persevering. India was rising, yes, but not evenly. In 2014, India chose a new kind of leader, Narendra Modi. His promise was simple but powerful. Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas. Together for everyone's development. He was the first prime minister in 30 years to win a full majority, and he arrived with big ideas. Make in India, Startup India, Digital India, Jan Dhan for financial inclusion. For a while, it worked. GDP grew. India became the world's fastest growing major economy. Global investors paid attention, and then a decision nobody saw coming. On the night of November 8, 2016, Prime Minister Modi announced that 500 rupees and 1,000 rupee notes, which made up 86% of the country's cash, would no longer be valid, starting at midnight. It was called Demonetization. The stated goals: wipe out black money, stop fake currency, cut funding to terror, push India toward digital payments. But what followed was chaos. Long queues at banks, hospitals refusing old notes, weddings canceled, vendors shut, daily wage earners left with no pay and no explanation. People stood in line for hours to get their own money. Over 100 deaths were linked to the disruption. And in the end, 99.3% of the currency came back into the system, which meant very little black money was actually removed. Yes, digital payments rose, but the cost for small businesses, farmers, and workers was heavy. Then came GST, the Goods and Services Tax, a unified tax system decades in the making. The idea was bold: one nation, one tax, one system. But execution, that was a different story. Too many slabs, confusing compliance, tech glitches, refund delays, and small businesses, the very backbone of India's economy, struggled to keep up. The reform was necessary, but its rollout felt like trying to fix an engine while the car was still moving. By 2019, the cracks were hard to ignore. Auto sales dropped. Factories cut jobs. Unemployment hit a 45-year high, and youth joblessness crossed 23%. India had opened its economy, but somewhere along the way, it had missed building enough jobs. Then came a silence unlike anything before. On March 24, 2020, with just 4 hours' notice, India went into a complete national lockdown to combat COVID-19. Trains stopped, shops shut, families separated, and for millions, life as they knew it just vanished. Migrant workers, the invisible engines of India's cities, lost their jobs overnight. With no transport, they walked for days, some for weeks, back to their villages. Some barefoot, some hungry, some never made it home at all. It became one of the largest human migrations since partition and one of the most painful. The economy contracted by -7.3%, the worst decline since independence. Over 120 million jobs were lost in just a few months. Small businesses, especially in retail, hospitality, transport, shut down permanently. The government launched a 20 lakh crore package, but much of it came as credit support, not direct relief. India's digital economy survived, but millions working informally, off the grid, were left with nothing. By 2022, the economy had begun to recover, at least on the surface. Stock markets soared. Startups raised billions. New unicorns were born every month. But it was what economists called a K-shaped recovery. The top grew fast. The bottom barely moved. Wages stayed flat. Rural demand was weak. Youth unemployment remained high. And women's workforce participation hit one of the lowest levels in the world, just 24%. India had the talent, but opportunity was not equally distributed. Why didn't India become a global factory like China or Vietnam? Because land is hard to acquire. Labor laws are complex. Logistics are expensive. And policies often change faster than entrepreneurs can adapt. India makes brilliant code, but not enough clothes, shoes, or circuit boards. That's not just an economic issue, it's a missed opportunity. Today, India is a study in contrasts. It has more than 100 unicorn startups and over 190 million undernourished people. It's building digital public infrastructure admired globally, but still struggling with access to clean water, quality schools, and secure jobs in many regions. This is the paradox. A rising giant, still carrying the weight of old chains. After independence, India wasn't the only country trying to rebuild. So were China, Vietnam, Bangladesh, South Korea, Taiwan. But they chose differently. China, under Deng Xiaoping, didn't argue over ideology. It opened its gates to foreign capital, simplified rules, and created special economic zones. Vietnam, torn by war, bet on private businesses and built strong light manufacturing. Samsung, Intel, they set up billion-dollar plants there. Bangladesh focused on garments and women's labor. It trained millions of women, supported microfinance, and built export strength from the ground up. Even South Korea and Taiwan, once poor, invested heavily in education, public health, and strategic industries. They weren't perfect, but they moved fast, and they moved together. India had all the raw ingredients: a young population, English-speaking talent, strong democracy, cultural resilience. But the path was often muddled, slowed by red tape, policy zigzags, and structural exclusions. It had ambition. It still does. But ambition without execution doesn't create jobs. So what now? India has a goal: $5 trillion economy. Pushed back, but not abandoned. It has the world's largest population, one of the world's fastest-growing fintech systems, and a youth that is plugged in, restless, and relentlessly optimistic. But to truly rise, India will need more than GDP points. It will need mass employment, especially in manufacturing and infrastructure. A radical shift in women's labor participation, public education that teaches real-world skills, policies that stay stable, digital, and fair, and a social contract that includes those left behind, farmers, migrants, and informal workers. In 2047, what will that story look like? Will it be a country of billionaires and broken bridges? Or a place where dignity isn't reserved for the top, but built into the foundation for all? Because the real success story of India isn't just economic, it's deeply human. And the future isn't just a goal, it's a decision made every single day. This isn't just India's question, it's every country's question that's been shaped, shaken, and shadowed by empire, by debt, by dreams. What kind of future are we willing to build? And for whom? If this made you stop and think, don't walk away empty-handed. Subscribe to the channel for more well-grounded financial storytelling and real-world insights. Share this video with someone who's trying to make sense of it all. And visit www.financetrending.com to begin your Finance 101 journey. Because knowledge should never be a luxury. Your future isn't canceled. It's just waiting for you to take the first step.